The quiet click of the deadbolt locking was a sound David had come to associate with the transition the moment he left the chief of police at the station and returned to being just Dad. Yet, lately, the line had blurred. He stood by the kitchen counter, carefully measuring out the coffee grounds, the silence of the pre-dawn suburban morning pressing in on him. He was still in his uniform pants and undershirt, his official leather belt looped loosely around his waist. The weight of his service weapon, usually a comfort, felt heavy with domestic incongruity. His son, Ethan 10, shuffled in, hair tousled, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Morning, Dad," the boy mumbled, reaching for a cereal box. "Morning, buddy. Got your lunch ready," David replied, his voice soft, a counterpoint to the steely tone he used in the briefing room. He held up a lunch sack. "Your favorite PB&J, cut diagonally?" Strict code enforcement. He forced a small smile. Ethan managed a small chuckle, but the humor felt thin. The tension in their small slice of suburban paradise, the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, had begun to bleed into the quiet moments. It wasn't the kind of tension you could arrest. It was the slow, insidious pressure of judgment. David finished dressing, the stiff fabric of his police chief shirt settling over his chest. He glanced out the window, past the spotless glass, and his eyes narrowed slightly. There she was, Brenda. She was already outside, even before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. 50-something, clad in a pastel jogging suit that looked less like athletic wear and more like protective camouflage. She moved with the precise, military-like deliberation of a woman on a mission. Her mission, David had learned, was the preservation of the standard. Brenda wasn't running. She was inspecting. She carried a tiny, silver clipboard and a pen, making fast, furtive notes on the pristine white pages. She moved along the border of her meticulously manicured lawn, occasionally bending to pluck a single, errant dandelion with a grimace that suggested she was defusing a bomb. The narration resonated in the quiet kitchen, the unspoken thoughts of David laid bare by the serious voice of the observer. David poured his coffee, the steam momentarily clouding his view of the antagonist. David felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a sensation far worse than the adrenaline rush of a high-speed pursuit. That was a clear threat, defined by law and protocol. Brenda was a threat defined by Bylaw 7.3, subsection C, acceptable shrubbery height. His neighbor's presence was a daily, non-violent assault on his family's peace. Over the last month, the complaints had escalated from absurd to genuinely antagonistic. It started with a formal warning about the placement of their recycling bin 3 inches too far from the curb. Then came the citation for the unapproved color of the bird feeder, claiming it violated the community's earthy tones palette. This was Brenda's genius. She wasn't just observing the rules. She was weaponizing them. She had somehow managed to turn the idea of a peaceful community into a tool of personal tyranny. She fed on the silent fear of fines and the passive nature of her neighbors. Most people, David knew, would rather pay the $25 fine than engage with the exhausting reality of her zealotry. He watched her approach the very spot where Ethan was expected to wait for the school bus in 10 minutes. It was a designated area, but Brenda had recently declared that the exact quadrant of the street leading up to it was considered her front yard easement, and therefore subject to her personal enforcement. She was now visibly measuring the distance of a small, decorative rock placed by the city, the bus stop sign. Her face was a mask of cold, judgmental focus. David set his coffee mug down with a clink that felt deafening in the silence. He was supposed to be leaving for the station soon, needed to lead the morning briefing, but his focus was cemented on the woman across the street. The job, the city, the crime, it all suddenly seemed secondary to the small, contained threat of the woman with the clipboard. He reached for his police chief jacket, the heavy, official fabric, a cloak of his true authority. He slipped it on, checking his reflection quickly. The uniform always straightened him out, reminded him of his role, his power. But he was conflicted. He couldn't use the authority of the badge to squash a neighborly dispute. The headlines would write themselves. Police chief abuses power over HOA dust-up. He had to approach this as a father, as a neighbor with one hand tied behind his back. He looked back at Ethan, who was now putting on his backpack, blissfully unaware of the petty, precise battle lines being drawn outside their home. David knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that today was the day Brenda would escalate. Today, the administrative paranoia would turn personal, and he, the chief of police, could only watch, waiting for the moment when he could finally drop the neighbor facade and remind Brenda of the difference between an HOA bylaw and a genuine legal authority. The wait was almost over. Ethan, lost in the quiet anticipation of the school bus, was idly tracing patterns in the dew-wet grass with the toe of his sneaker. He was indeed 3 inches past the curb line, an unconscious act that carried the weight of a felony in Brenda's highly regulated world. He held a small, plastic toy in his hand, a miniature police car gift from his father. He was gently rolling it back and forth on the concrete slab. Brenda's shadow fell over him first, cold and sharp. "Young man," her voice cut the morning silence, a startling, high-pitched shriek. It wasn't loud enough to wake the neighbors, but loud enough to pierce the quiet confidence of a 10-year-old boy. Ethan froze, pulling his foot back immediately, but it was too late. The damage, in Brenda's mind, was done. "Do you have any idea what you are doing?" she demanded, standing over him, her finger rigid and pointed at the minuscule indentation his sneaker had left in the lawn. "This is Whispering Pines property. This is my easement. You are damaging the certified fescue. You are trampling the aesthetic integrity of this entire block." Ethan's face flushed crimson. He clutched the toy police car tight. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to." Just a silence. Brenda snapped. "Don't apologize to me. Young man, respect the rules. You need to respect the rules that maintain the value of this community. Where is your parent? I'm going to have a word with the neglectful individual who let you out here unsupervised and uninstructed." Inside, David felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a searing, internal heat. He was fully in uniform now, ready to walk out the door, ready to leave the domestic world behind for the city's chaos. But this small, contained domestic chaos had captured his complete attention. He saw the genuine fear in Ethan's eyes, the shame inflicted by a total stranger over 3 inches of grass. He threw the door open and walked toward them, moving with the measured, controlled pace of an officer approaching a hostile scene. He did not run, but every muscle was coiled. "Brenda," David said, his voice low and deliberate, keeping the chief steady calm. "That is enough. He's 10 years old, and he's waiting for the bus. This is a public easement." Brenda turned, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face, but she immediately dismissed it. David was just the man who lived in house 412, the man whose recycling bin was perpetually 3 inches off. "Oh, here we go," she sneered, waving a dismissive hand, the silver clipboard rattling. The father, "Well, good. You need to be aware of what your child is doing. Sir, I have documented the trampling of the fescue, and I will be filing a formal complaint regarding unruly juvenile behavior at a public stop. You clearly cannot control your son, nor can you respect the property standards that we all uphold." She took a step back, folding her arms across her chest in an aggressive, self-righteous stance. "Frankly, your parenting is as shabby as your unapproved bluebird feeder." The insult, the casual, dismissive attack on his parenting, cut deeper than any knife. David paused, taking a deep, almost shaking breath. He looked down at Ethan, who was staring at his shoes, humiliated. "Brenda," David repeated, stepping slightly in front of his son, his body language shifting from defensive neighbor to something heavier, more authoritative. "You need to walk away right now. You have made your point, however misplaced, and I assure you, it will be noted." "Noted?" She scoffed. "Oh, it will be more than noted, neighbor. It will be fined. And I don't respond to vague threats from irresponsible citizens. You can expect paperwork." She spun on her heel and retreated with brisk, satisfied steps back to her house, her job, in her mind, complete. David knelt beside Ethan, pulling his son into a tight, reassuring hug. Hey, look at me. She's just grumpy. She has no power. Okay, don't you worry about it. You go catch your bus. Ethan nodded, wiping his eyes, and walked to the curb as the yellow bus pulled up. As the bus pulled away, David stood on the silent street, the quiet suburban scene restored. But the quiet within him was shattered. She had promised paperwork. She had promised a fight. He looked down at his own official uniform, the uniform that made him the chief of police, and a grim, resolute expression settled on his face. She has just made the biggest mistake of her self-righteous life, he muttered to himself. David's morning briefing was chaos, but his mind was elsewhere, running simulations of HOA bylaws instead of traffic patterns. The narration here captures the internal conflict and the gravity of the decision David must make. True to her word, the paperwork arrived. David was interrupted mid-afternoon by his assistant, who tentatively placed the thick, vanilla envelope on his desk. The contrast between the official police work and the HOA nonsense was absurdly stark. He read the complaint. It was a masterpiece of malicious exaggeration. Brenda had flipped the script entirely, claiming she was the victim of intimidation tactics by an aggressive neighbor. The complaint included high-resolution photos of Ethan's foot, diagrams showing the curb line, and a long, detailed history of David's family's perceived noncompliance. The fines attached were punitive and ridiculous. The true moment of escalation came when he saw her signature and title, Brenda R, Vice-President, Whispering Pines HOA. She has skin in the game, David thought, leaning back in his chair. She's not just a loud mouth. She's part of the official mechanism. She's got power. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the HOA president. Linda, he kept his tone measured, professional, introducing himself simply as David, from House 412. The complainant's neighbor, Linda. I just received this complaint, David began, carefully. It's baseless. My son stepped 3 inches onto the grass for a second while waiting for the bus, and Vice-President R threatened him. Now she's twisting the narrative. Linda's voice on the other end was weary. Look, David, I know Brenda is ... enthusiastic, but she's the VP, and she provided photographic evidence. She's claiming you tried to intimidate her. She said you used your size to loom over her. The deliberate lie, the calculated deceit, struck David with full force. Brenda hadn't just exaggerated. She had fabricated an official charge of intimidation. She was actively using her HOA position to weaponize lies against his family. David's voice dropped, losing all trace of neighborly compromise. Linda, he said, the chief's authority finally cutting through. This is David Miller. I am the chief of police for this municipality. Your vice president has just knowingly filed a false, documented, and punitive complaint against my family for a non-existent infraction. This is now no longer an HOA matter. It is a matter of documented harassment and potential official misconduct by an officer of your association. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and profound. Linda finally stammered, Chief Miller, I had no idea. Now you do, David said, his voice cold. I am giving you 48 hours to formally retract and dismiss all complaints filed by Vice President R against House 412. If this issue is not resolved internally, I will be forwarding all documents including her intimidation claim against Stan, on-duty public servant's child to our legal team for an official investigation into the management and conduct of your association, including potential misuse of community funds for personal legal retaliation. You need to handle your internal problem, Linda, otherwise, my department will handle it for you. He hung up the phone before she could reply. David stared at the stack of trivial HOA papers next to his genuine homicide reports. He leaned forward, pulled a clean sheet of official police department letterhead toward him, and began to write. He wasn't writing a check for the fine. He was writing a declaration of war. He was going to use Brenda's own meticulous system against her. The petty tyrant was about to meet true, measured authority. The threat David had leveled at HOA President Linda was not an idle one. He was not a man who played games, especially when the target was his family. However, to leverage his position as chief of police against a private homeowners association. He needed more than just a family grievance. He needed evidence of actual, prosecutable misconduct or violation that transcended petty squabbling and entered the realm of municipal concern. He immediately engaged Detective Rick, a sharp investigator from the fraud unit. David kept the purpose vague, calling it a community relations review, but his instructions were precise. I need you to cross-reference every publicly available record on Vice-President Brenda or cross-check these HOA bylaws against her property's municipal permits, tax assessments, and any legal fees paid by the association. Find me a violation she can't find her way out of. David threw himself into the work with the same intensity he would apply to a major cold case. He spent hours in his office after everyone else had left, the silence of the building broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. He scoured the HOA's public records, pulling up archived meeting minutes and financial reports. He was looking for the hypocrisy in the paperwork. His focus was drawn to an obscure financial addendum within the bylaws, a clause requiring the immediate disclosure of any personal financial transactions made with HOA funds exceeding a minimal threshold. He also found an older, forgotten municipal code regarding external structural conformity, a regulation Brenda herself often cited. David cross-referenced this against Brenda's large, decorative concrete fountain, the one she constantly boasted about for setting the community aesthetic standard. A quick search revealed it had never received a final, approved permit from the City Planning Department, a clear violation of both City Code and HOA Bylaw Section 9.1. It was a detail so mundane, so bureaucratic, that Brenda had clearly overlooked it in her obsession with everyone else's yard. Detective Rick's findings, delivered the next morning, provided the true fuel for the counterattack. Rick projected a financial spreadsheet onto the wall of David's office. "Chief," Rick began, pointing a laser at a line item. "Vice-President R has been meticulous about documenting every $25 fine. But look here, this large transaction, categorized as enforcement consultation, a $1,200 payment made 6 months ago to the HOA's contracted lawyer, Mr. Alan Price." Rick leaned closer. "I called Price's firm. On that very same day, Price filed an injunction on Brenda's personal behalf against a neighbor on the next block who was trying to install a solar panel, a dispute that had absolutely nothing to do with the HOA's enforcement duties. She intentionally mislabeled the payment." David stared at the line item. "Fraudulent misuse of association funds." That was the key. This wasn't a petty bylaw squabble. This was a financial offense that could legitimately trigger a full forensic audit by the city, a consequence that would utterly destroy Brenda's reputation and power base. She had used the HOA's bank account to pay for her personal vendettas, and she had documented the deception herself. She used the system to protect herself, David said, his voice quiet but heavy with realization. "Now, the system will hold her accountable. We have the reason, Rick. We have the weapon." The next day, the atmosphere in Whispering Pines shifted. The community, sensing the chief was fighting back, began to shed years of silent fear. David's wife, Sarah, was inundated with visits from neighbors. Elderly Mrs. Henderson arrived with a manila folder thick with her own complaints, fines for a chipped bird bath, but a sworn statement that Brenda's own garage was 4 feet over the property line, documented by an old survey. The file grew with accounts of verbal harassment and fines for unapproved garden gnomes. David realized the true purpose of his action. This wasn't about 3 inches of grass anymore. It was about tearing down a structure of fear built on trivial rules. He called Linda, the HOA president, one last time. "Linda, the 48 hours is up. I have documentation of fraud, improper permitting, and dozens of neighbor testimonies detailing systemic harassment and abuse of power by the vice president. I am bringing everything to the official HOA meeting tomorrow evening. You have one choice. You handle this internally, or my department will launch a full, public investigation into the management and financial practices of the Whispering Pines HOA. The choice is yours." He hung up, the silence ringing in his ear. The community center meeting was set for the next night. Brenda would be there, confident and prepared for a yelling match. David, however, was prepared for a surgical, professional dismantling. He put the HOA files into an official police department folder. The sight of the city seal a silent promise of the authority he was about to unleash. The mandatory HOA meeting began with a strained sense of order, but the room was charged with nervous energy. The folding chairs were all occupied, a sign of the community's desperate need for resolution. Brenda, however, was completely in her element. She stood at the podium, bathed in the harsh fluorescent lights, her silver clipboard clutched like a scepter. And finally, Brenda announced, her voice dripping with self-importance, "We address the egregious and continuing behavior of the Millers at House 412. I have here, on this chart, a visual representation of the severity of the threat posed our property values." She turned to a large, hand-drawn poster detailing Ethan's 3 inches of fescue trampling and David's aggressive intimidation. She spent a full 10 minutes railing against David's family, concluding with a recommendation for a triple fine and a formal legal cease and desist order. The HOA board members, led by the visibly uncomfortable Linda, sat stone-faced. Brenda paused, expecting the usual silent submission. "Are there any objections to the imposition of these fines?" she asked, her eyes sweeping the room in a challenging glare. Just as the silence was about to settle, the double doors at the back of the room burst open with a sudden, decisive swing. David walked in. He was not in a suit, nor casual attire. He was in his full, immaculate police chief uniform, the dark jacket perfectly tailored, the brass buttons polished to a mirror sheen, the star of his badge gleaming under the lights. His presence was not aggressive, but utterly imposing. He moved with the slow, controlled gait of a man who belonged in command. The room fell instantly and completely silent. Every single head swiveled, following David's path as he moved to the front. Brenda's mouth, which had been open to deliver her final closing remarks, snapped shut. Her face went pale, the color draining away as she finally grasped the gravity of her error. She was looking at the man she had called a negligent parent and a bully, now standing before her as the highest representative of law in their town. David stopped directly in front of the HOA board table. He acknowledged them with a curt, formal nod, bypassing Brenda entirely. "Chief Miller?" Linda stammered, shuffling papers nervously. We weren't expecting you in uniform." David's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, resonant, and entirely professional, the voice he used to address a city council. "I am here tonight, officially, as the chief of police, a property owner, and an aggrieved party. Ms. R. has raised an issue of intimidation. I am here to address that, and the associated matters of official misconduct." He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He reached into his official police department folder and pulled out the documents. "Ms. R.," David said, turning slightly toward Brenda, who was frozen at the podium, "you have presented a case built on 3 inches of grass. I am here to present a case built on the laws of this city." He first handed the HOA president a thick stack of neighborhood testimonies. "This document contains sworn statements from dozens of your neighbors detailing systematic harassment and abuse of your official power, spanning years." Next, he produced the municipal code violation for her infamous fountain. "This document details Vice-President R's failure to obtain the final, necessary permit for her primary front yard fixture, a direct violation of both City Code and HOA Bylaw 9.1, the very code she uses to fine others. Her own front yard is, technically, an illegal structure." Finally, David laid down the most damning document, the financial records provided by Detective Rick. He placed his finger on the transaction. "In this document," he stated clearly, his voice cutting through the silent room, "details the vice president's fraudulent use of $1,200 in community funds to pay for her personal legal injunction against a private neighbor. Mislabeled in your books, enforcement consultation. This is official misconduct and fraudulent misuse of association funds." Brenda finally found her voice, a high, panicked squeak. "That's a lie. You're abusing your badge. You're trying to intimidate the board." David turned to face her fully, his expression unmoving. I am not intimidating anyone, Ms. R. I am presenting evidence of a crime to the governing body of a private corporation. As Chief of Police, I am obligated to inform the Board that if these documented violations of corporate trust and municipal code, including the illegal structure and the financial fraud, are not addressed immediately by this Board, I will be legally obligated to forward this entire file to the District Attorney's Office for a full criminal and forensic audit of the Whispering Pines HOA. You have a choice, Linda. Either the Board holds Ms. R. accountable for her actions, or the city will. The HOA president, Linda, looked from the damning financial record to David's impassive, powerful uniform, and back to Brenda's terrified face. The choice was clear. The threat of a city-wide investigation into their books was far worse than firing the vice president. The meeting is suspended for a 10-minute executive session, Linda declared, banging the gavel down with a sharp, final crack. The battle was over. The sound of the gavel slamming down for the executive session echoed in the community center, a sound far more definitive than the polite clink Linda produced. David, the chief of police, remained standing by the front table, his uniform a silent, unmoving guarantee that the conversation behind the closed doors would be efficient, professional, and final. The 10-minute session stretched into nearly 20. The neighbors in the audience sat in tense silence, whispering amongst themselves, a palpable sense of hope and fear coiling in the room. They weren't waiting for a vote. They were waiting for a savior, or a new tyrant. They were waiting to see if David Miller's authority was enough to overcome years of petty, institutionalized abuse. When the doors reopened, the HOA board members filed back to the table, their faces grim, but collectively displaying a noticeable sense of relief. Linda, the HOA president, picked up the gavel, her eyes carefully avoiding David's, before settling on Brenda, who was now standing, rigid and pale, having been called back from the hall. The executive session has concluded, Linda announced, her voice flat, official. The board has reviewed the evidence presented by Chief Miller, as well as the testimonies provided by numerous residents. She paused, took a deep breath, and delivered the verdict. Effective immediately, the board has voted unanimously to: first, dismiss and permanently remove all fines and complaints filed by Vice-President Brenda R. against House 412, the Miller family. Second, Vice-President Brenda R. is hereby censured for professional misconduct and immediately stripped of her office and all association duties. A soft, collective sigh of relief swept through the audience. A few neighbors started a timid, muffled clap, which Linda immediately cut off with a stern look. Linda continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. Furthermore, the board finds documented evidence of Brenda R.'s misuse of association funds. She is required to immediately reimburse the HOA for the $1,200 payment made to Mr. Alan Price, should the funds not be returned within 72 hours. The full file regarding fraudulent use of HOA funds will be forwarded to city officials for investigation. Brenda stood for a long moment, completely motionless. Her entire world, her self-appointed power structure, her identity as the community's moral guardian, had just been obliterated by the very laws she claimed to uphold. Her face, which had held that look of smug certainty for years, crumpled. "You can't do this," she shrieked, her voice suddenly cracking with genuine, desperate emotion. "It was 3 inches of grass. You're letting a negligent parent get away with property damage. This is an abuse of power. I will sue the entire association." David, still standing at the front, finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost conversational, yet dominating the room. "Ms. R," he said, meeting her eyes directly, "I am not abusing my badge. I am using it to enforce the law against documented fraud and official misconduct. The case of the 3 inches of grass is dismissed. The case of the $1,200 theft is not. You have 72 hours to comply." Brenda had lost. She looked around the room at the neighbors, who were no longer afraid, at the board, who had sacrificed her to save themselves, and at David, who was simply standing in his uniform, the silent embodiment of her complete failure. With a frustrated, defeated sob, She turned and stormed out of the community center, throwing her silver clipboard into a garbage can near the exit. A final, impotent gesture of rage. The meeting adjourned in a flurry of cautious, relieved congratulations to David. He didn't linger, acknowledging the nods and murmurs with a quiet smile. His work here was done. The true resolution, however, was not the victory at the community center, but the return to the mundane peace of the next morning. David was out of uniform, in a simple work shirt, standing with Ethan at the bus stop. The sun was fully out, the light golden and warm. Ethan, without prompting, stood squarely on the concrete slab. His feet were near the curb. He wasn't doing it out of fear. He was doing it with a subtle, shared confidence. "You know, Dad," Ethan said, looking down the street, "she's not out here today." "No," David replied, gently ruffling his son's hair. "I think Brenda is going to be very busy with her own grass and her own paperwork for a long time." Just then, David spotted a flicker of movement across the street. Brenda was indeed outside, in her faded gardening clothes, looking distinctly smaller, less imposing. She wasn't carrying a clipboard. She was actually trimming the edges of her sidewalk, seemingly under the direction of an HOA landscaper who was now overseeing her. She caught David's eye. For a split second, the old, venomous glare returned, but it instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense fear. She quickly retreated into her garage, pulling the door down immediately, unwilling to face the man who had humbled her. A car pulled up, driven by Mrs. Henderson. She slowed down, rolled her window down, and gave David a wide, genuine, and deeply grateful smile. "Good morning, Chief," she said, her voice buoyant. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it? The quietest morning we've had in years." "It certainly is, Mrs. Henderson," David replied, returning the smile. As the bus arrived, David watched his son climb aboard. He stood there for a moment, simply absorbing the silence, the real silence, free from the threat of documentation and judgment. He was still the chief of police, dealing with the city's chaos, but his corner of the world was safe. He hadn't used his badge to oppress. He had used it to protect, to enforce true justice against petty tyranny. He turned and walked toward his house, the familiar weight of his own peace restored. The battle of the curb line was over, and the father had won.